Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez does it again. She says some of the most ridiculous things, but this time she compared the United States to Nazi Germany, doubles down on it, and then gets support from fellow elected officials. There was a hearing to discuss a bill that would form a committee to investigate the implementation of reparations. Okay. And the mask is off. They can barely contain themselves anymore. The left is coming for your guns, and they can't even pretend otherwise when challenged. And it's also become clear as day that the left has little regard for life except for their own. We'll tackle all that and more. I'm Big E, and this is the Liberty Cast. Now, before we dive in, I just want to give a big shout out to BZ over at SHR Media for having me on as a guest in the Berserk Bobcat Saloon. That's such a cool name for a radio show, isn't it? But thanks, BZ, for the opportunity to chat with you. It was a great conversation, and I am looking forward to doing it again. All right, let's do this. AOC. Now, I'm sure you've heard this past week that the good representative from New York's 14th district compared the detention centers at our southern border to concentration camps. AOC, will you please crack a book? I beg you. Actually, you know what? No, don't. Don't, because you are the gift that keeps on giving. But let's listen to what she actually said before we break it down.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border. And that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. And if that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something. And that the fact that concentration camps are now an institutionalized practice in the home of the free is extraordinarily disturbing. And we need to do something about it.
Boston University should be embarrassed. How did she manage to graduate from BU without being able to finish a thought or put a coherent sentence together? I mean, what is this?
That is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. And if that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever.
All that dead air you heard, this was done on Instagram, I think an Instagram story, and all that dead air you heard was her making these wild hand gestures because she couldn't figure out what to make come out of her mouth. But what's equally astonishing to how poorly she can construct a sentence is that she said so little, but yet there is so much to break down. But let's start with what concentration camps actually are. Now, from the Holocaust Encyclopedia, and I quote, "The term concentration camp refers to a camp in which people are detained or confined, usually under harsh conditions and without regard to legal norms of arrest and imprisonment that are acceptable in a constitutional democracy." The reason these people are in these detention centers is so that they can be processed, and the vetting and the legal process for their asylum claims or whatever claim they're making to enter the country can be addressed. So there's the regard for the legal norms that is talked about in that definition. But what she's saying is that ICE is actually starving illegal aliens, beating illegal aliens, forcing them to shave all their hair, inadequate bathroom facilities, no medical care. She's saying that ICE is operating gas chambers and subjecting detainees to firing squads. Is that what she's saying? Because if it's not, then what she must be saying is that the Holocaust didn't happen. Because you can't on one hand say ICE is operating concentration camps and everything attendant to them, but then turn around and say, well, they aren't being forced into hard labor and they aren't being exterminated. Well, if they're not doing that, yet they're still concentration camps, then they didn't do that at Auschwitz, Belzec, Dachau, or Treblinka. She hasn't even been to the border to see exactly what's going on down there. She hasn't visited one detention center. Now, are these centers 5-star resorts? Of course not. Resources are maxed out. But not because ICE is trying to torture these people. Resources are maxed out and taxed to their limits because of the current open border policy that is inviting illegal aliens in droves to come here. And again, they come willingly. She loves to run her mouth without knowing the first thing about what she's talking about. Because we all know that there are no similarities whatsoever between ICE detention centers and concentration camps. So she's effectively become a Holocaust denier, which fits right in with her fellow freshman representative Ilhan Omar, but we'll get to her ridiculousness in a second. But if you don't know history or have any idea what actually happened in concentration camps, then these ideas are way over her head. Because let's just let the practical and logical fallacies in her assertion. Not one Jewish person tried to get into a concentration camp. Not one. There are thousands of people trying to get into this country every day, knowing that they're going to end up in one of these facilities if they get caught. If these places were actually concentration camps, we would not have the problem of illegal immigration that we have now. Now, I am not suggesting that we do this, not even as a joke, because that's not something to joke about. But what I am saying is that they're coming here because they know they're going to be living better than they are in their home country. Which leads me to the next fallacy in her argument. The most common way that people survived these camps in World War II was by being rescued by Allied forces. Some people did escape by other means, getting forged documents, escaping during transit, etc. But how do people leave ICE detention centers? By law, they can only be held there for a certain amount of time before they are released into the interior of the country. Released, free to go. Go forth and conquer. Which, if you believe that this is an invasion, as I do, then conquer is the appropriate word. There's so much more wrong with what she said, but I wanted to get back to Ilhan Omar and how she backed AOC's play.
There are camps and people are being concentrated. This is very simple. I don't even know why this is a controversial thing for her to say. We have to really truthfully speak about what's taking place. And this is why it's really important for us to abolish ICE and make sure that we have an agency that is accountable to the people.
Wow. Spoken like someone who learned English by watching television. Context and nuance are completely lost on this woman. And she goes on to say that illegal aliens are being treated inhumanely in these centers, which I think we've already thoroughly debunked. I want to move on here, and I never thought I would have to spend this much time on someone so obviously stupid. And I try not to use pejoratives like that because for the most part, the people in elected office are not stupid. Their policies are stupid. And I suppose a case could be made that if they espouse these stupid ideas, then they are stupid. But intellectually, or just based on raw IQ for the most part, these are not dumb people. AOC, on the other hand, she barely has the brain power to toast a slice of bread. Lightly. And she doesn't like to do long-form interviews because it exposes her intellectual shortcomings. So she does these Instagram stories where she can ramble on and get her message out, and then it disappears after, 24, 48 hours. It's preserved, thankfully, by some enterprising people on YouTube and some other sites, which, like I said, she's the gift that keeps on giving. But anyway, let's continue the march. I guess the biggest story this week, aside from AOC showing her stunning lack of knowledge about history, is the talk of reparations. There were hearings this past week on H.R. 40, which is a bill that would create a commission to study proposals for implementing reparations. Okay. The whole thing is just so ridiculous. And why do we need to waste time with hearings on this? I mean, either study reparations, either do it or don't do it. What is the purpose of the hearings? I don't understand that. But this isn't a subject that I have ever really given a lot of credence to because, again, it's stupid. And I wasn't raised to be a victim. I wasn't raised to think that white people are the cause for the plight of black people in this country or the cause of any setback that I may have personally suffered in my life. For the most part, any setback or struggle I've ever gone through has been the result of a decision or a series of decisions that I made. Whether those decisions were just bad from the jump, which I've made a few of those, or based on faulty information. I made those decisions. Now, I do grant you that there have been times when, even in hindsight, I thought I did everything right and things happened that were out of my control. It was not, however, due to institutional racism or implied bias or microaggressions or any other nonsense bullshit excuse that someone wants to throw out there. Does racism exist? Of course it does. And if I ever came across a racist that was brave enough to let that freak flag fly, I'd respond like this.
They still make you?
That was back when Chris Rock was still funny. But the idea of reparations makes no sense on any level. Slavery, of course, is one of the worst, darkest periods in this country's history. Is the black community still dealing with the repercussions of what happened 150 plus years ago? To an extent. But I think it's more a result of what happened after slavery was abolished. A lot of Southern Democrats were former Confederate soldiers and attained positions of power and put the black codes into effect immediately after the Civil War ended. The Jim Crow laws that grew from that continue to serve to keep black people down. The South fought a war to keep slavery going. Yes, the Confederacy lost, but they just looked for other ways to serve that same purpose. This is terrible. But in the midst of all of that hatred aimed at black folk, a lot of black people still found a way to persevere and in many cases succeed, or at the very least make an impact by fighting against these laws. People like Hiram Revels and Joseph Rainey, the first black senator and representative respectively. And later Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist and owner of the Memphis Free Speech and Highlight. Those are just three of the people that come to mind. Those people actually had the deck heavily stacked against them, and they still managed to succeed at the highest levels. But getting back to the idea of reparations, actually, you know what? We'll get back to that on the other side of this quick break. I said earlier that a lot of what is plaguing the black community has to do with what happened after slavery was abolished. Yet in the face of all of that opposition, we still had business owners, senators, congressmen, you name it. But what else did we have then? Intact families. All the way up until LBJ's Great Society, when, thanks to changes to the welfare system, it became more advantageous for women to have babies out of wedlock and not have fathers in the home. I submit that the damage done by that has had more lasting effect than the damage done by slavery. And I think the evidence of that is pretty compelling. But if this passes and they do decide to pay black people for the wrongs done to their ancestors during slavery, where does that money come from? Taxpayers? And who gets that money? And do the descendants of black slave owners have to pay other black people? And what about the Native Americans who owned black slaves? How many people clamoring for reparations know about that? I'm going to hazard a guess and say not many. It's not something they publicize or even really want you to think about. Hell, they don't even want you to think about it at all. What they want is a bunch of people nodding in bovine agreement to every silly notion that crosses their minds. But back to the obvious questions, if you buy into the premise, how are we going to collect this money? Is it going to be from, like I said, the taxpayers? Who's going to collect it from the Native Americans whose ancestors owned black slaves? How much are we going to collect? How are we going to determine how much each person is going to get? I mean, the logistics alone sound like a nightmare. Not to mention that there's really no way to legitimately quantify who would be entitled to what if such a measure were to pass. And I imagine that the commission that they're planning on putting together is going to come up with that, but it's going to be some arbitrary number that has no rhyme or reason, just like pretty much everything else in Washington. And during the hearings, you had people like Senator Spartacus, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Danny Glover, and some guy in a clerical collar spewing nonsense like this.
A national reparations policy is a moral, democratic, and economic imperative.
The matter of reparations is one of making amends and direct redress, but it is also a question of citizenship. In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair weather patriotism. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them.
We have not had direct conversations about a lot of the root causes of the inequities and the pain and the hurt manifested in economic disparities, manifested in health disparities, manifested in a criminal justice system that is indeed a form of new Jim Crow. And so we as a nation have not yet truly acknowledged and grappled with racism and white supremacy that has tainted this country's founding and continues to persist in those deep racial disparities and inequalities today. It is a cancer on the soul of our country and hurts the whole body politic, making us all fall far short from being who we say we are when we swear an oath that this will be a nation of liberty and justice for all.
And when I'm talking for reparations, I'm actually talking to my white brothers and sisters. You need this more than we do. You need this for your soul. You need this to be able to look black persons in the eye and say, I acknowledge the mistake and I want to be part of the solution to repair that damage.
These people are absolutely ridiculous. Spartacus went to Stanford, studied at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and went on to Yale Law School. It doesn't get any more privileged than that. He's a senator. He is and rubs elbows with some of the most powerful people in the country. And Danny Glover, he was at one point a very well-known and respected actor. Coates is said to be a talented writer. I haven't read much of his stuff yet, since I really only heard about him as a result of this reparations nonsense. And then the last guy was the minister. He's a bishop from some Episcopal diocese in DC, I guess. But the left, they keep telling us that the things that we're against are moral imperatives. They keep preaching to us about morality. But let me tell you this, as long as they keep telling us that abortion on demand is a woman's right, they can keep their moralizing to themselves because I'm not having it. A wall is an immorality. Paying black people for something that happened 150 plus years ago is a moral imperative. White people need to pay black people reparations to repair damage to their souls for something that they had nothing to do with. Come on. Get out of here with that nonsense. All right, let's press on. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is a subject that we haven't talked about much, if at all, really, on this show, and that is that June is Pride Month. It used to be Gay Pride Month, but with all of the other subsets of people that have hijacked the Gay Pride movement, they dropped the gay altogether, I guess, to be more inclusive or something. But I'm not talking about homosexuality. I began this segment by reciting the Second Amendment, so I mentioned pride because it seems that there's been an uptick in the number of gay people and transsexual people and so on and so forth that are arming themselves and learning how to use firearms. But it's not something that you really hear a whole lot about. And you're definitely not going to hear about it in the lamestream media. And it's not something that gets a lot of play in publications that are popular in the 2A community. But it should. Now, I don't know if this surge in gun purchases signals a shift in ideology in the LGBTQAIP 2S MNOP XYZ community. Probably not. But in 2017, which is the last year for which we have reliable statistics, there were 52 documented murders where the victim was killed simply because they were gay or trans or something other than straight. So that's one a week. 52 too many, really. Now, I don't care who you sleep with. I don't care what gender you identify yourself as long as you're not a guy going into a girl's locker room or bathroom, I couldn't care less. If you treat me with respect, treat my family with respect, I will reciprocate. And if I see someone being victimized, I'm going to intervene, and the sexual orientation of the victim is of no consequence to me. Everyone has the right to exist, regardless of whether or not I agree with their political views or sexual orientation or identity. So if I wore an FFL and I owned a gun store, which I would love to do, I would welcome the business of anyone who respected the Second Amendment, was not a prohibited possessor, and sought my help in arming themselves and getting the training that they needed to make sure that they could defend themselves against those who would attack them simply for whatever reason. The fact that they live a sexually alternative lifestyle is only relevant insofar as they tend not to feel welcomed in the gun community as a whole. And I really wanted to touch on that so that we could try to change that perception. All right, moving on. I've said this before, and it's a popular phrase these days among conservatives, but the mask is off. And there has been ample evidence of it up to now, but here is yet another example. At a town hall in Illinois, someone asked a perfectly reasonable question, one that has been asked on this subject many times by many different people. You know what? Just listen to this.
Senator Morrison, you have an SB, you have a Senate Bill 107 to take away my semi-automatic firearms, to ban them. But there's a clause.
Not to take, now let's, to
There's a
clarify,
clause in the bill.
I'm not taking your gun away from you. You just can't buy any new ones.
Well, you want me to turn it over to the state police.
You can't buy new ones.
Unless I give you a fine, unless I pay a fine for each firearm and register them, then I get to keep it.
Okay.
So, if I get to keep it, if I pay a fine and register it, then how dangerous is it in the first place? Why do you need to ban it all? Why do you need to try to ban the use and the purchase that are being purchased today?
Well, you've just maybe changed my mind. Maybe we won't have a fine at all. Maybe we'll just be a confiscation and we won't have to worry about you paying the fine.
That was Illinois State Senator Julie Morrison, obviously a Democrat. But let's be very clear. Her mind was not changed in that moment. I don't know her. I haven't researched her positions, but I think it's safe to say that she's a leftist. She hates having law-abiding citizens own guns, and confiscation is her preferred method of disarming people. She lost her cool and she blurted it out at that moment because she knew that there was no logical answer to the question. If you check out the video, she's visibly irritated and it's obvious that she lost her composure. She's obviously not a very talented politician because leftists have been dodging that question successfully for a long time. Well, successfully might be too strong a word, but they know that the end game is confiscation. But now it appears that for whatever reason, she wasn't ready to admit it, but others have, like Newcomb Swalwell and Senator Spartacus. They've both put forth plans to confiscate guns and ban assault weapons, which don't really exist. But they've taken to calling them military-style weapons, which is equally asinine. Civilians cannot get fully automatic or select fire weapons. We've been over that repeatedly, so we're not going to relitigate that now. But you can't get them. So what are they saying? They're saying that any weapon that looks like an M4 or an M16 or an AK-47 should be banned. They're basing these proposed bans on how these rifles look. They look scary and shootier than rifles with wood furniture, even though I know the AK-47 has wood furniture, but that aside. They're basing it on how they look, just like they do with people. Never mind what you bring to the table. If your skin is white, they're going to judge you a certain way. If your skin is black or brown, they're going to judge you another way. Some real deep thinkers over there on the left, aren't there? My apologies for getting off topic. That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But let's get back to the subject at hand, which is these firearms bans or proposed firearms bans. So just to further highlight their ridiculousness, there are actually firearms out there that are more powerful and firearms that can do far more damage than the 5.56 NATO round that the AR platform uses most. Yet those weapons don't show up on any of the lists of proposed banned firearms. I know that other weapons like the Kalashnikov type weapons are also on the list, but the Ruger Mini 14 and the Mini 30, which fire the same rounds as the AR and the AK or Kalashnikov respectively, are not on any list that I've seen. It's completely ridiculous and arbitrary. The AR is the most popular rifle in America today. The fact that less than 3% of homicides are committed with rifles is seemingly irrelevant to these clowns. That criminals don't generally obtain their weapons legally is seemingly irrelevant to these clowns. Law-abiding citizens apparently do not have a right to protect themselves or their families as far as these clowns are concerned. Why is that? Well, we know it's about power and control, but I think it ties into something else that we are seeing from them, and that is a lack of respect for life. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive because they claim to be trying to save lives, but you know what? I ran way over. I rambled entirely too much. But we're going to go into a bit of overtime right now because I really want to get this in. We're going to take a quick break right now, and when we get back, I will explain exactly what I meant by that. The left is in full disarmament mode, and I said that one of the reasons for that, aside from power and control, is that they have a lack of respect for life. I've told this story before on the show, but it bears repeating now because it's relevant to the topic. But I was told a while back by someone who I grew up with and considered a friend, still do, because their ridiculousness in that moment doesn't erase decades of friendship from my perspective. They clearly have a different mindset. But anyway, during a discussion about guns, I got them to admit that since all handguns are basically semi-automatic, that those should be banned as well. So this person admitted that, and my response was, so someone who lives in a rural area where in an emergency, the nearest sheriff's deputy or state trooper could be 20 minutes away, they should not have the means to protect themselves if someone breaks into their home intent on doing them or their family harm. And this person's response was, well, if it's your time, it's your time. You can't fight that shit. I was floored because this person has children. And I know with every fiber of my being that they would use a firearm to protect those children and do so with extreme prejudice. So that hypothetical person's life would mean nothing to this person, which means that my life meant nothing to them because the Liberty Bunker is located in one of those rural areas. But Big E, come on, that doesn't mean that they don't have respect for life. Well, I contend that that kind of thinking, even in a vacuum, does demonstrate that. But I'm using that as one leg of the stool, so to speak. Another one is their stance on abortion, which we touched on earlier. But they continue to take the stance that killing a baby is nothing more than a procedure to get rid of a parasite or a clump of cells, which is clearly anti-science. They love to call conservatives science deniers, but look at this example. In Cleveland, Ohio this year, doctors performed an in utero surgery to repair the spina bifida birth defect of an unborn baby at 23 weeks. Rather than do that, the left would have said, kill it. But doctors repaired the spinal cord, closed the mother's womb, left the baby in for the remainder of the pregnancy, and the baby was born on June 3rd and seemed to have normal brain function. Now, in case you weren't aware, spina bifida causes the structure of the spine to develop abnormally, which in turn causes the baby to be born with various brain abnormalities. The disease cannot be cured, so things could develop with this baby over time. But the left would have just told those parents, give up, kill the baby, try again. And that, to me, is a lack of respect for life. And then there's the whole euthanasia craze that is all the rage these days. But unfortunately, we're in overtime, and I have to leave it there. I'd like to hit more topics than I did today, but AOC's blatant disrespect of this country and the lives of 6 million Jews that were just snuffed out during the Holocaust, the left's utter disregard for the Constitution and the people they claim to represent, apparently gets me more fired up than I realized. And maybe it's time to expand the show a little bit. We'll see. But anyway, on that note, thank you all for listening. Please subscribe, leave a review. You can find us on iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio. You can also find all of our shows since the beginning on the website, thelibertycast.net. You will find about 2 months worth of shows in the recent shows, and then a link to an archive of all of the rest of them since the show began almost a year ago. So you can find all of our content in one spot if that's what you prefer. But aside from that, you can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's at The Liberty Cast on all 3 platforms, and you can find additional content there. But again, thank you all very much for listening, and as usual, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.